Hi, welcome to this Open Security Summit in May 2022. We have Don Murdoch, who's going to take us to a very interesting presentation. He's done several times in the past. We've been very well received, and I'm sure it's going to be also awesome here. So, Dan, over to you.
All right, thank you very much. Hey, Don here. I've been around the security business for quite some time. Several of you may or may not have a copy of one of the two industry-leading books that I've put out that relate to security operations. One's on incident response, one's on threat hunting. I currently function as the NetWitness Security Risk Office Director within RSA. You've probably heard of RSA. We've been around for a while. GSE, essentially, I got my combat training in the world of academic computing, and I do teach one of the courses for the SANS Institute. So that's who Don is. So let's go ahead and get right into this. And I'm going to talk today, as the title slide talked about, adversary simulation. How do you do this? Why do you do this? What are the considerations? And some sense of an actionable plan by the time we get done with a 30-60-90 approach. And the very first thing I want to start out with is a true blue business concept. Nope, we're not going to talk about fancy pen testing tools or anything like that. We're going to talk about where you work and who you protect and what makes a difference to them. And we call that the value chain. So from a traditional management perspective, the value chain, and I went and got the definition because it's pretty laser focused, are the activities that your organization does, whatever organization you work for, in a specific industry, to deliver some sort of a product, a good or a service in your market. So for example, if you make automobiles, your value chain is raw material supply, parts supply, an assembly line, and a delivery mechanism to get automobiles out to dealerships, and then long-term care and maintenance we call maintenance, and going down to the mechanic. So that's all your value chain. So that's actually very, very important, because we as information security people want to be business relevant. Okay, why do we care? The value chain provides a ready catalog of exposure points, especially if it's internet facing and interacts with the general public in some way, shape, or form. It will provide you a roadmap to valuable data. And if you look at what the modern adversary is doing, they are after your data. There are a few examples, very shining, huge ones, of non-United States countries or NATO allies in getting inside of the defense contracting companies and the people making military systems, and stealing those military systems and then manufacturing them for 10 cents on the dollar, or perhaps, since you're in Europe, a lot of you are European, I should say 10 pence on the pound, if you will. Night vision goggles, the F-35 Thundershark are but a few examples. You also really want to be business relevant to your leadership team. Whatever your leadership team is, you want to be speaking in a language and a term that they understand. They care about the value chain, because businesses, as a general rule, are in place to sell goods and services, to turn a profit, and to grow. So if you're looking at protecting that value chain, it's only going to make you better off. The other thing is, it also advises you from an adversary simulation perspective, what are the systems that you cannot adversely affect? One of my colleagues, John Strand, tells a story about how they were doing a penetration test in a hospital system, and the guy actually got onto a system that was being actively used for laser eye surgery. And if he had done something adverse to that system, it could have been catastrophic for the patient. So that's another very, very important point about understanding your value chain is, what can't you touch? Now, where do you go find this out? Your business continuity disaster recovery team, if you have a business continuity team, a disaster recovery plan, they have a ready-made map of this, and they have a prioritized map. If you don't have a ready-made map, take a little bit of learning from how to build a business continuity disaster recovery plan, use some of those models to go investigate your organization, and you could kill two birds with one stone. The outline of a BCP, BRP, maybe you'll identify some risks along the way for the want of a spreadsheet exercise, but you could actually, get the map of your organization. So our security architecture protects that value chain. It's people and processes, security awareness techniques, change management processes. We want to be trying to push security left with the idea of sec dev ops or dev sec ops, whichever term you prefer. And then there's tons and tons and tons of technologies. And some of these technologies are easy to circumvent and some of them are hard. So when you think about and when you prepare to do an adversary simulation project at your organization or a client organization, think about what they have. Think about what is likely to thwart you. It is getting harder and harder to do pen test and AdSim against larger corporations who have made strategic investments in what's called managed detection and response, or MDR, and have deployed a desktop agent that can do a good job seeing what's going on. The head of the NSA, the United States National Security Agency, said a few years ago, it was the guy who ran the tailored access operations team out of the NSA, said their biggest worry was any organization that they interacted with, that's a polite term, their biggest worry was whether or not they had full packet capture and the ability to look into encrypted traffic. So, be aware of that, be aware of what you have. So these are the things that you need. Now, there's a phrase here, and you'll see this a few times out of this whole effort, because most of you should be within an organization trying to protect it, and you're thinking about doing this. You want to think red, define the threats, and the outcome that we want to make sure that you're achieving is you're being blue or blue team to design and test defenses. Historically, a lot of these activities occurred in isolation. You'd have red team activities, full penetration tests, third-party organizations coming in, seeing if they could get in from the perimeter, all those sorts of things. Meanwhile, you have, if you're fortunate, you have people trying to defend the organization, looking through the security logs. Maybe they have a SIEM platform or other alerting tools, or they actually get reports out of their next generation firewall, something like that, doing blue team on defense. Today, it's all the rage past several years. We talk about purple teaming, the idea of performing a red event, some sort of compromise effort, and then immediately turning around and seeing if the defensive blue team can detect those digital shenanigans and defend it and defend against it. The other thing that is really emerging here in this space over the last several years is in the yellow boxes. Attackers think in graphs and defenders think in lists. And this is one of the things that if you're on a defensive role and you want to do an adversary simulation project, your thinking will need to adjust, because if all goes well, you will gain some sort of a toehold through an environment, either through a fish mail, compromised USB drive, drive-by download, something like that. And you're going to have to produce a graph. You're going to have to figure out how you go find machines on the network. You can't just go run Bloodhound. It's very noisy. You've got to go figure out how to be stealthy, those sorts of things. Oops, that wasn't very good. I think I accidentally hit the end key. Let me go back to the front. I've never had this happen before. All right, we're going to go to the presentation reverse. Look at all that cool content. Woohoo, look at where we're going, and we'll get back to the front. Bing, 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 bing. Okay, now let's get us back on track. Don has his hand on the right part of the keyboard. So I talked with a friend of mine, Jake Williams, who now is like the CTO for SCYTHE. And a couple of years ago when I put this together the first time, I said, can we get a good idea of what adversary simulation is, what purple teaming is? In an adversary simulation, and this is where the majority of the talk is going to focus on, a red team member, someone in charged with performing pen tests, product security checks, things like that, does an assessment using techniques and tools used by a specific adversary, or as I'll show you, a subset of adversaries. That's what that team does. Now in purple, and this is what a lot of maturing organizations are doing today, the red team will perform a particular action and they'll work hand in hand with the defensive team to make sure that their actions are validated. And if not, then you're going to rinse, wash, repeat until you have an ability to detect it. It could be 2 or 3 times, it could be 20 times. So understand the difference. With adversary emulation, you're trying to incorporate threat intelligence, you're trying to incorporate domain knowledge, your list of vulnerabilities, who the adversaries are who are likely to come knock on your door, all those sorts of things. And as a security pro, you're going to think red and act blue on behalf of the organization. So this slide has been updated a couple of times. In 2017, the Gartner Research Organization, they're basically a well-respected think tank who looks at IT operations, security space, things like that, and they come up with various ways of describing a market and describing what these tools are. And they came up with a term that you can use in your research, but I don't want anybody to be confused that what are called breach and attack simulation tools are the same thing as an adversary simulation effort. There are some very sophisticated BAS tools out there, and that's a great thing for you to search to get an idea. If you want to think about testing a particular part of your security architecture or something like that, that's where these tools come into play. And in 2017, when they came out with this term, the BAS tool was way over here. But today it's in a peak point. Now, unfortunately, I couldn't get a graphic, but this is where it actually sits today on the curve. So in order to do this, you need a plan, right? You have to have a plan. You have to outline and have some kind of a purpose. And I'm going to show you a couple of different ways of categorizing that and describing that on the slides coming up. You want to figure out what is your outcome. If you want to come up with an adversary simulation effort where, say, you are most likely to be attacked by adversary groups that are aggressive in the financial services sector, think about what you have, what you know, what you don't know. Think about how they would engage, and then you could start, putting some thoughts to paper. Having some sort of a written outcome, a page or two to explain what this thing is, will help you communicate it. And there's surprising to me the value of words on paper. When you actually look at what you want to do in some outline of a plan, and you say, "Gosh, for my adversary simulation plan, and if I were a determined attacker, I would win if I could extract from the primary system we had the entire order history of all of the customers over, say, the last 5 years. If I could do that and get that out to an Azure blob space or an AWS S3 bucket under my control, I win." And why would you win? Because that's what the successful attacker is capable of doing. They want your data. They want to control your environment, or they might want to apply ransomware to the environment, things like that. But the really super knowledgeable espionage types, they're really after the information that you have for competitive advantage. In order for your overall program to succeed, your effort, you really have to understand and do what's called a KSA assessment. KSA stands for knowledge, skill, and ability. You have to make sure that you have people with knowledge of how the tools work of your environment. They have to know how the tools work and tools can work safely. And they have to have an ability to use these things, keep quiet about it, be on the lookout for problem areas, those sorts of things, okay? You will have time constraints. So when you think about these projects, if you have an organizational charge code system as part of your security program, having people charge to one of these projects might be a really good idea to say, we spent 10% of an FTE, full-time equivalent is what that stands for, in the first year to do this simulation. And we found 37 weaknesses that now have a plan over the next year to fix. That's a pretty darn good return on investment. And understanding how your effort will be measured in the long run will help you paint a very good picture later on, 6 to 9 months from now. So where do you start? MITRE Corporation in the US has a couple of frameworks, and one of the things that I like is the APT3, and they also have an APT29 one that's come out recently, Emulation Plan. So this plan you can go download. There's a link on the slide. It's got a spreadsheet set of tools. It assumes that you gain some sort of a toehold somehow through a spam or a fish mail or a USB chain, something like that. And then you're trying to execute what APT3 does. There are many other ways to learn what APT groups do, but this one here is pretty much canned. All you have to do is figure out for your own environment how you're going to make that initial toehold into the organization. And it's a pretty good tool. It has a spreadsheet that goes with it for command line activity on a Windows platform, and also using another commercial tool called Strike. Another activity that you can go through in thinking about how to construct one of these efforts is to use the MITRE Cyber Prep. The whole idea of Cyber Prep, it's about 15 pages long. It's very, very meaty reading, but it's not a long document. This gives you strategies in order to engage in threat preparedness for your organization. It gives you a structured level of thinking. It gives you ways to look at your environments. Now, the second point there, realize that the knowledge, skill, and ability of a modern adversary today is almost commonplace with well-written books. Just go look on Amazon for penetration testing books. There's probably 50 to 60. Then look for BlueTeam defense books. There's probably 4. Outside of the forensics world, there's probably 10 of those. But there's a lot more people on the pen testing red side because it's kind of sexy and kind of cool, right? It's really neat to do that, and it's really fun, and you can make your bones, as we say in the US. And there's lots of people trying to do that, and there's less people, as active in the market in order to defend. So cyber prep really causes you to look at your adversary for their intent, match your defensive measures. There's 5 adversary levels to help structure. You could take something very light and just look at a vandalism project, which would be most likely would be a web-based defacement or possibly modification of a document library and some sort of messing up that document library, things like that, or full-fledged cyber espionage, like you see in the movies or on various television programs. And then you can look and see what lines up from a defensive perspective for these types of adversaries. So this is some really good reading for you too. You want to think about how to gain support. How are you going to do this? And my first bullet point there is adversary simulation maximizes your $ security $pend or your security spend. So, right now, make some notes. What do you own in your organization? What do you have? And how can you make the best use of those tools and technologies to defend your organization? Because if you own a premium next generation firewall and it's turned up and it has all the capabilities in place, it should give you really good visibility. So with the right amount of effort, you should be able to show that that super expensive next generation firewall you bought last year and that you're paying maintenance on for at 20% of a whole lot of money is in fact doing its job. So there's a lot of value in that. And again, this thinks about, if I take a little bit of effort, I can get a whole lot of value out of this project and program. Okay. An adversary effort will make sure that your technical controls will work, can find weaknesses, those sorts of things. You can add a little bit of support artifacts in the long run. That will give you an extra little bit more for an audit environment, those kinds of things. And lastly, if you have a security operations team, these efforts can be really great at retraining if you take really good notes and packet captures and log records and things like that. So one of the tools, and we have this in the SANSEC 530 class that we use, is how do you go learn about an adversary? MITRE has an attack simulator. And it takes a while to learn how to use it. Basically what I did here was I added in 3 adversary groups that are pretty well known. The adversary groups have been put together by MITRE and some others, DoD, NATO allies, things like that, where there's an idea of what does this group do? What do they go after? What do they do? So here, I realized that this is an eye chart and you can't read it. So I blew up a little part of it in the lower left-hand corner because you just can't read this, but you can read the lower left. And the idea is, if you wanted to model what the techniques are and figure out what you want to do for 3 different financially motivated adversaries, FIN 6 and 7 and 8, and they don't have catchy names. They're just, short names. You got to go read the MITRE documentation and understand who they are. Like, you're not going to see Cozy Bear or Red Dragon. Those are named by different orgs. But you take this tool, you give each group a score, and then you colorize that, and you can see that because of how the colorizing is working, all 3 of these groups use the red stuff at least 2 groups use the yellow stuff and 1 group uses the green stuff. So if you looked at this and you say, gosh, all these items that are here that are red, we have to go find some way of attacking our environment to do our SIM project. Well, malicious links are used by all 3. So if in part of your adversary simulation project, you said, we want to figure out a way of getting phishing mail in, and it's got to be a malicious link that's under our control, which should be an asset in AWS or Azure, so it's under your control. That would mimic what an attacker would do. Now, in contrast, think about what you can do to detect. Now, if you're a large org and you have a fairly sophisticated security budget, and if you take all of these tools here that I have listed on the top line, you could have a lot of variety and a lot of capability to do detection, but you'll still have some gaps. So this is kind of like in the lower hand side, we have this notion that most amplifiers that musicians use go from 1 to 10. And what we're saying is, if you have enterprise desktop response, you have a Windows 4688 CLI auditing turned on, you have Audit D on your Linux boxes, you have host intrusion prevention systems, you have TLS inspection. For Europe, that's difficult. For me in the US, it's a piece of cake. You have network admission control, you have flow data, you have DNS analysis and an ability to see who's using DNS. You have next-gen firewalls, and they're fully configured with all of the features that they have. You didn't just buy a fancy box and didn't do any configuration to make use of the subscriptions you bought. You have a really good detection profile. So you have a good chance to look at what the adversary can do on this page and then see what you can detect on this page. So this is a nice tool put together by MITRE. One of the really neat things you can do with it is save out intermediate JSON files, and you could say, for our first attack, we did all this. For our next attack, we could add some more and save that. And then you could also, use 2 JSON files and do a coloration. But it's a tool to help structure your thinking. So if you want to run a project, first and foremost, you got to know the roles, who's in the environment, what's your use case. You can use the attack framework to develop your use case. There's some specific guidance that you really want to look at. You can do what's called again, another business concept, SWOT analysis. Look at the strength of your organization. If your organization is really strong at desktop incident response, or you have a really good perimeter security posture, that's a strength. And you may be hard pressed to defeat that. But if you can, that an adversary can. What are the weaknesses in your organization? Maybe you don't have anti-spam in place. That's a tremendous weakness. That could be a great way in. What are the opportunities? What is your program going to gain? What are you going to gain? And what are the threats that are likely to be arrayed against you? Tons of stuff. And always think about your outcomes. So you have to think about the tools you're going to test, the systems you're going to attack. How are you actually going to do those sorts of things? And you want to figure out how to deploy some kind of capability, let it simmer on the network, and then use it a week later. There are a few isolated lab projects you can use for getting a handle on this. Detection lab, auto build, automated lab are 3. I've seen detection lab and know Chris Long. It's pretty nice in what it does, because it builds up a complete environment with MITRE Caldera, a domain, Security Onion, and Splunk and things like that. And it gives you a nice little simulation environment. You could also P2V and make copies of certain things in a virtualization environment and use that as well. When you think about attacking your environment, and one of the most common ways that people are going to get in these days is through some sort of credential harvesting process. That's one of the most common, not the most common, but one of the most common. I wanted to give you an idea of what your people might be on the lookout for, or things that might actually work in your campaign to try to gain a toehold on an end user system from the outside. Got a list of the most common phishing campaigns today, and I gave you a couple of examples of what smishing or SMS phishing looks like. And when I did these, I said, look, be better than some of the the spammies out there, like this PayPal one. It came from an unknown phone number to, I don't have a PayPal account. And this one came to my cell phone, by the way. So it's like, okay, I don't have a PayPal account and I got something from PayPal. But the other thing that really kind of was a big warning to me is they didn't even get the PayPal case ID format correct. If you're going to try to pretend to be a financial services organization and use this pre-texting, that's the language that we use because you're creating with these communication tools, you want to create a sense of urgency on the recipient to take action. Because a savvy, what we would hope that a savvy user would look at an email or text that say, that's not real, delete. But we talk about pre-texting a lot. So, realize that people will be silently correcting your grammar. And yes, I do in fact own this t-shirt. I get a lot of kick out of it. So how do you measure your project's success? Okay. Two things you got to remember when you're talking about measurements is what cannot be measured cannot be managed. And so cognate, let that permeate in your mind a little bit. It'll come to you why that's true. And the next one is just as important. Not everything that counts can be counted, and vice versa. And everything that, that can be counted counts. Not everything is true. So think about how you're going to measure your success. Now, I have in the BlueTeam Handbook SOC Threat Hunting Edition a bunch of metrics that can be used for how a security operations center work. So if you have a security operations center, you can use these or go get some more information on these metrics. But I want to highlight 3 of them because 3 of them really make a difference. And you got to have the data, and you have to be at a position to be able to collect this data to get these measures in your adversary simulation project. So you have to know what the MTDD is. Somebody in your security operations function is going to receive some form of alert, some form of communication, we hope, that says there's a problem here. And how long does it take that process for a qualified person to make a decision that an alert is an incident or not? When I ran an MSSP environment, the best my SOC analysts got here was 8 minutes, which is pretty good. Then you have mean time to compromise, which is not the same thing as mean time to privilege escalation, or if you want to be in vogue, PrivEsk, because that's what the in vogue people say. So MTTC is the amount of time it takes from the minute that you initiated your attack process to the moment where you were successfully compromised some kind of a target. You gain a toehold. So that's what MTTC is about. We gained some kind of access that could give us communication, command and control back to our site at on some box somewhere. That's what MTTC is about. MTTP is for the privilege that you need for the attack that you're going to execute, for the adversary group that you're going to emulate. What is it they want? And what privilege do you need in order to do that? You may need to go after and find out who the database administrator is, the person in your organization that has direct access to your Oracle, SQL, or MySQL database where you keep the goodies. It takes a while for that to happen. But again, you have to know what PrivEsk means and who actually has the privilege. And then you have to be able to measure how long it took your adversary simulation team to get there. Okay. Your architecture, because remember I talked about maximizing the security spend, centralized logging. You really want to have good endpoint visibility. The absolute minimum you should have before you engage in one of these projects is Windows Sysmon, assuming that you're all running Windows with Windows Event Collection. That's the absolute minimum. You should not go on these projects without having pretty decent endpoint monitoring. Other things you'll need in your environment, some device logs would be useful, things like that. And of course, people. You want to think about what SOC security service you're going to test. It may be a very bad idea for your adversary simulation project that you're working on if the security operations function gets the idea that someone got on the machine to capture that hard drive and send it out for external forensics analysis by a qualified third party that could take 3 days. You could easily rack up a huge unexpected bill in that process. That could be very expensive. So think about the security services you offer. There should be a point when some services are engaged and some aren't. and also think about how you're going to report out. And if you produce, if 10% of the alarms that you produce in a campaign over a 1 month period or some kind of an effort are as a result of your adversary simulation project, you want to have truth in reporting if you on your monthly stats to say, about 8% of these came from our adversary simulation project. So we didn't have, a 10% increase in alarm conditions. We caused 10% of them. So our alarm conditions really didn't change this month. Things like that are things you got to think about. Maximize each event for team performance. You're working here with people, make people sharper, make them better, figure out what kind of analysis you can do. I'm going to move on. There are some candidates for your tool inventory. One of them, this is one of the few pages that actually has a little icon there. So start with a tabletop exercise. Before you go crazy with tools and stuff, go get a copy of Backdoors and Breaches by Black Hills Information Security. You can order it off the web. It's a nice little tool set, $20, $25 US, something like that. It's a card game, and it's a really great tabletop simulator tool that you can use. Once you get there, there's tons of open source tools that you can use. There's a list here. There's some various low-cost tools. There's build environments you can use to create things. You can P2V if you want, which is physical to virtual, stand things up on a virtualization platform, isolate those 20 or 30 resources so they look like your network. But if you destroy them, you don't destroy production. There's all kinds of things that you can do. And the last thing is, as I mentioned earlier, breach and attack simulation tools really aren't an adversary because they don't behave like a person. They're designed to test controls. Pen Test IT maintains a list. They update this once a year. It's a good list to check when you're looking for things in the tool inventory. Thought this chart might be useful for you on which tools are advancing. And this has not changed. By the way, this list has not changed much since 2020. This is the 2021 list. Make sure you have air cover. Air cover means that you have a designated senior management individual who is capable of and understands what you're doing. So if you really get in trouble, you have somebody you can go to. Don't just do these things on your own, okay? What your air cover, your senior manager, will hopefully ask of you is, have you rehearsed? Do you know what you're doing? Do you have a willing partner in the organization? And how are we going to make sure that the things that you are doing in your simulation test aren't a real attacker, okay? You need to give some serious consideration on the potential professional impact that you may have on your defenders, all right? And this is going to be unique to every organization. Are you going to let your defenders know that you're doing a project? There's a plus to that. They're on the alert. They're paying more attention. Their senses could be a little bit higher. The flip side is, as we know, whenever people are told that they're going to be measured, monitored for performance, they inherently perform better. Even when if they have any inclination, it changes their behavior. Okay. We do need to make sure that observer bias doesn't get in place. That's called the Hawthorne effect. If you have an incident response command function, don't let that person know necessarily that you're doing an AdSim, because you want to get the best performance out of your incident response commander that you have. The last thing is, you need to treat this seriously and don't gloss over writing a quality incident report, because if you're doing this well, you will find gaps in coverage, and you want to take advantage of this project to prove that you can cover gaps. Make sure that you have some kind of objective criteria. Our goal was to get to the relational database that has the customer data within 5 working days. Did you get there or not? Our goal was to not be alerted for any change of any of my elevated access groups. Did you get there or not? Make sure that people keep track of things. I'm a super huge fan of time dating everything. If you put that in a spreadsheet of major events that we're seeing and you're coordinating to UTC time, it makes sorting that spreadsheet a snap, because that's something you really, really want to have. It can look like a tree. And again, you will be, in fact, developing staff skills over time. Incident response for your defenders is a team sport. It really is. So, look at how your organization is operating. There's an acronym in DevSecOps we call CALM, C-A-L-M-S. What's your culture? What automation do you have? Are you operating in a lean environment? Do you have good measurement tools? And are you sharing knowledge with each other? It's one of those things that when you read about DevSecOps, you'll see this acronym in there. Everybody should be asked to contribute to these things. Now, part of AdSim is to be focused on the adversary. And I gave you the link to this here. This is a really, really, really good way of thinking about it. This is the incident response hierarchy of needs. If you've ever heard of the Maslow hierarchy of needs, this is an adaptation to it. But we're looking at, do you have an inventory? Are you getting data? Do you have some kind of way to do detection? Is there triage? Your purple teaming function, your adversary function is going to be operating right here in the middle of that. So this is a good reference tool. I wanted to share a success story with you of teams that do this and then integrate red teamers or people who've done these activities into the SOC. Most often, some kind of cyber incident is declared. Blue team may be looking at whatever the individual systems are. If you enter your incident response person, if you have a red team function, and you can bring them in when major cases happen, since they spend time doing this and running these various tools. In the case that we're talking about here, they observed something and they said, let's try XYZ on our network. They performed a live attack that they thought the attacker was going to do, figured out, sure enough, we're vulnerable to that. And in real time, they coordinated a fix in the network for what the red teamer did based on the alert they had. And within 4 hours, the adversary was attempting the very same thing. So there's a lot of value your security can gain by having people with red team skills and attack skills and bringing them in at the right time when the cases look really bad. This was but one example. By the way, I got this out of a Pen Test Mag. That was a really nice write-up a couple of years ago on this article. So I've got some takeaways for you, and then I have some other slides after this, by the way, since I knew I had you for an hour. This is my so I've got some more stuff coming up. So from a 30, 60, 90-day perspective, first thing you want to do in the next month is understand your value chain. Who's in your org? What are your systems? What do you care about? What are your major business processes? Do some kind of threat analysis. Come up with a simulation plan. Look and see what attack groups. But like I showed you with the MITRE ATT&CK, go download a Docker image, click some buttons, turn some cells yellow and green and red, and get some idea and say, gosh, if these types of people are coming after us, we're in a world of hurt. Look at your defensive posture, turn things on that compare the two, and then you'll have a nice chart. 60, you need some kind of an environment to stage and test out your red and blue functions, whatever tooling you're going to use, maybe P2V some environments, something like that. You may have pre-production development environments. Maybe you could attack some of those that are configured as production is configured, and then you'd want to be sure that works. And you could go so far as, we're going to attack the QA environment as if it was production, and we're going to smoke check, which means totally destroy the QA environment if we have to, because we know and we've tested, we can recover it within a day. And QA isn't as important as production, meaning if we take production out of service, that's bad. We shut the company down. If we take QA out of service, we shut down the QA team. They can live for a day or two while we do recovery on the QA servers, things like that. Every 3 months, be trying to do something in your environment. That's game day. You've got to have your simulation. You have to know whether or not your blue team is going to be looking at it. You got to have some kind of an independent observer. You need your air cover person who's there, who's ample, can pay attention, that kind of thing. And remember that when you make measured improvement in every engagement, you're moving the needle for your company. So I also wanted to give you an example of a fairly inexpensive tool that you can go get. This is out of a guy out of the Netherlands, I think. It's called BT3 BlueTeam Testing and Training, and it's from Encryptio.io. He has several no-cost modules and many, many modules that are inexpensive. So this is a very easy tool to implement. You basically get a copy of Kali, install it, get an API key. It has some tools that can, there's 4 examples of real command and control traffic that look like 4 common adversaries you can just run. There is a tool that can replay packet captures from a prior campaign to test your incident response functions, your next generation firewall, things like that. It's very, very low risk because the way this thing works is it generates a script file that you can compile and then you run. So you can review the code. And that's one of the things I really like about this tool. It's set up a little bit like Kali or like Metasploit. We figure out what tool we're going to use. We pick a tool, we run it on the environment, and it's running in the background. On the client side, you just need to get we need a way of somehow getting the Python file out to the client. If you could run this on a Raspberry Pi. You could use one of the Python to exe environments. You may produce a huge executable, but frankly, you don't care if it's 15 meg because it's got all the Python goodies built into it. It's usable. You can distribute that in a USB drive. And again, you are in control because you can read the code. And if you don't have a defensive solution, you can go download Security Onion. Many of the default tools in Security Onion will pick up a lot of these things. Havix has been around for a while. I picked this because I did a talk for an industrial control event, and Havix is an industrial control focused tool. Here we're seeing that the native emerging threats rule set that's delivered with Security Onion or Snort or Suricata today, this is a rule set because this slide's 2 years old, will detect this tool. Then for whatever you have that can generate a view of incident response data, your SIEM, this happens to be the very nice elastic-based user interface for Security Onion that can detect this tool. There's 4 alerts, and you can go use the Onion to dig into a lot of the traffic. So there's a nice visualization tool here you can use. And if you let this run for a day, I ran a cyber range for a day at a university in Virginia Beach. I generated something like 32,000 alerts. Kind of freaked me out when I came in because I'd forgotten I left it running. And I was like, what the heck did I do? Sure enough, it ran well enough and detected enough that we had a huge amount of alert data. And you can see it's pretty stable. Not quite sure why I had a blip, but it worked out really well. So that's kind of where I end on this. I have to run off. I have a teenager in need of an immediate pickup. I think I can probably over chat take a couple of questions and give you guys about 5 minutes.
If anybody wants to ask some questions, please feel free to pop it on the chat, or you can raise your hand. We can unmute you, but don't forget you do need to be quick. Okay, if there's no questions, I'm sure if you think of any, I am sure that you can reach out to us and we can get your questions answered after this. Thank you all very much for joining. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.